Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Welcome to the Commonwealth Club. I'm George Hammond, Chair of the Humanities Forum, which organized tonight's event. We have with us today Fred Dust in another one of our online conversations, and very appropriately, we're talking about his new book, Making Conversations. We hope that you've enjoyed the 300 and some programs we did since this COVID crisis began in March. And tonight, or this afternoon as it is, we are going to be talking to Fred about how to make good conversations. We hope that we've followed some of these rules that he's laid out over the last year, but we're going to go into the details of it. He's certainly done a great investigation over his life on this. So Fred, welcome to the Commonwealth Club. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here. It's like, I remember well when I went to go see Leon Panetta, I think, at the Commonwealth Club, like years and years and years ago, like for the first time. So happy, like a real honor.
It's a pleasure to have you with us. And so you start your book with a little bit of history of how you got involved in this case, political conversations, an organization that was extremely well known for doing clever things to attract attention. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that and how it moved you in the direction of conversations, and then we'll back up a little bit.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because I went back and forth between majors in college where I was actually doing like political. I was studying like comparative revolution, South African studies, things like that. And I was on my way to go to Zimbabwe. I'd gotten a fellowship to go and work with guerrilla soldiers in Zimbabwe, and was applying for it. And I suddenly was like, why am I doing this when this is happening here on the ground in the US? Because it was like the late 80s, HIV/AIDS was happening. And there's this remarkable creative organization called ACT UP that's doing this remarkable stuff. And so I went and worked with ACT UP for a while. I will say I didn't work at the epicenter of the ACT UP movement, which really was here on the East Coast. I worked in kind of Seattle, where it was kind of a little less ACT UP-y than some things, but still, I was so inspired by what they do, and I think sometimes people forget that they existed, and it was a really important, powerful organization,
I think it's pretty hard for anybody who was paying attention to forget about ACT UP. Especially after the other ways that people tried to get attention for their issues in the 70s and the 80s, thought ACT UP was very clever about how they went about it. And it was obviously a crucial time, but I think anybody who was paying attention remembers ACT UP.
Yeah, and it's important to say that, you know, at that point we talked about that as a sort of being a genocide level event, right? And it's like, and that was both here, but that was also in Africa, and it's like, and so it was really eerily close to moments that we know now, actually, in some ways.
Yeah, it's, you know, of course, AIDS has been not conquered, but modified and put in a box and controlled. People don't realize how close to a death sentence that was at the time when it came out, and for the first 4 or 5 years, and how scared people were. And the only reason that they are more afraid now is because no one knows how this is being transmitted, COVID-19. Whereas once you found out how what it didn't get transmitted, what AIDS did not get transmitted by, it was easier to deal with people who had AIDS for a lot of people. But there was a lot of fear for a while about that.
That's right. And, you know, I think what's interesting about that is that it was a really critical part about the notion, in a way, kind of like it helped birth the idea of making conversation, because the reality is you couldn't at that moment, for instance, just be with somebody who said, trust me, right? That didn't work. You had to have a real conversation about how, and you had to kind of agree upon the rules of interaction. And so it's interesting, George, I wrote a little piece for Instagram, believe it or not, that was on the rules of COVID, like gatherings during for Christmas. And it's amazing how accurate it was also for the idea of consensual sex, or the ideas of kind of like just like disease transmission, or I mean, it's fascinating, really, really interesting how it kind of spans a whole bunch of different kinds of conversations.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to get into sex right up front.
No, that's all right. Everyone's expecting it, Fred. So, did you ever get to Zimbabwe?
You know, I did. I got to South Africa. I got to Cape Town, and then I got like to the border of Zimbabwe once for a lecture, and that was only once. But just to give you a context of when this was while Mandela was still in prison. So like I remember writing a paper being like, where do we think, like, what will happen with Mandela in the next 5 years? And literally, I remember like minutes later, like he'd been released. It was a really phenomenal moment, fascinating.
Yeah, well, it's something that intrigued me all the time too. And actually, I was in Zambia for a month and a half while Rhodesia was becoming Zimbabwe, a little bit before you were thinking of going there. But that's a totally different conversation. So let's talk about how you also had a model for really good conversations and why. You mentioned that you're in several things in your book and other places that your mother was a great conversationalist, but you had a couple of reasons why. So why don't you tell that story?
My mother was actually what I would call like kind of the perfect listener. Like, so she like she in the sense that she listened with such joy, right? So it's like, so she I sometimes say like listen like it's gossip, was like something that you really want to be hearing. Right. And my mom did that. And what was interesting is that strangers would come up to her on the street and just like they'd want to tell her their life story, and she'd be interested and engaged. And so, George, as you know, like at some point, with my teams, when I was like, oh, you guys are getting a little less good at listening, like you're spending more time on your devices and taking notes as opposed to really like leaning and listen. I thought at first I was like, listen like your mother, and that obviously does not work in all cases. And so that's how we, right. It's like, and so that's how we developed the idea of kind of creative listening, is like we need something that's a bit more, has more theory and science and psychology behind it than just listen like your mother. Though, yeah,
especially if you want this to last, because the generation whose mothers are all on their phones the whole time that they're pushing them around, they're not going to want to listen like their mother did.
I think
at least that won't be helpful.
And I mean, to be really honest, like my great grandmother was a really phenomenal. She was like, I learned everything I learned about storytelling from my great grandmother. Like it's like, and who could tell these like perfect 20-second stories that I talk about in the book a little bit. And
right.
And really, she was a magical storyteller.
Yeah, and you talk about that in your location section too, about the bench that she used to tell her stories on.
That's right.
It was nice. We'll probably get to that when we get to that section. But you also mentioned that your mother maybe was lively because in her conversations, because she had a deaf brother, and so she had learned sign language and was more expressive.
That's right.
But she must have also listened too. She must have also been a real listener, not just a dramatic persona.
Yeah, and when you're in a household with a deaf, so one of the things that happens, because it was her brother, like the family chose silence because it's like they in essence they gave him kind of priority. But what happens is you start to listen with your complete body when you're in a household where actually you can't hear. So it's this really remarkable thing. It's why one of the things I suggested earlier on is the idea that like consider having an all silent Thanksgiving or an all silent meal, and like, and then what can you do in that kind of context? And George, I should say, one thing that also really made it feel like it was really critical to me was the notion that when I was 24, my mom, not the notion, the thing that my mom had a stroke, a pretty severe and serious stroke, that left her aphasia, which meant that she could still listen, but it was harder to listen. And so, to be honest, my mother, June Dust, would reach out and hold my hand, hold my face, just so she could kind of make sure she could take it in. And that was really powerful. The notion that basically like she was working, again, she was working really hard to make sure that she was still listening to you. And that I thought was really just fairly stunning for me and very, very influential on everything. I mean, I won't meander, but one of the things that really came out of that was that I was like, I've got a timestamp on me. It's like, because her father had died of a stroke at 30, and like, it's like, and my job is to be out there and meet everybody in the world, like just get to know everyone's life and learn as much as I possibly can. And so that's kind of that's a lot of what made the book happen. Actually, is this weird hunger.
Well, you lay out 7 different parts of really good communications and conversations, and the first 2 sound like your parents. commitment and creative listening. So commitment, let's talk about commitment first, because it's very interesting. You make the point that you need to want to have a conversation. And you, as the antithesis of that, you mentioned how most people are sitting there waiting during a conversation until they get their turn to speak. So how do you get that commitment, and how do you stop the antithesis, which is extremely common? You can see it in almost any conversation. Although some people don't wait, they just keep talking.
Well, it's really funny, George. So I will say that Diane Morris, who has the Diane Morris lecture series in the Bay Area, I don't know if you've been, and has been like a dear friend to me all the way through. So she invited me to come do a lecture at her series whenever. It's like 2 years ago. I can't remember exactly when it was, but and at that point, like, I only had 6 fees. It just and like I didn't have commitment, and we knew we had to get to 7 C's. Like that's a basic, right? And so I did that lecture, and somebody raised their hand in the audience. So I really owe it to the Bay Area. So somebody said, well, what happens when somebody comes at me and they hate me, and like they already like disagree with me, and I was like, oh right, that's a thing that happens now. And so I was like, out of my back pocket, I had no idea. I was like, well, what you do is you commit to them, you commit to the people first in a conversation, and you hold your values secondary. Which interestingly, George, has both kind of like relevance if you think about the innovation process, which is like often we ask you to kind of put your ideas back behind you and then kind of go forward, but also is related to something that I hadn't realized influenced me, which was theater when I was in high school and doing improvisation, which I don't know if you know the rules of improvisation, but one of them is this notion of you're there, you're committed to the people on stage, like you're there to make them successful and not. And so the really famous story is, I don't know if you know this one, but that Joan Rivers came onto Second City stage, and they did it. They were like, okay, the scene is you're getting a divorce, and her husband was like, but Joan, what about our children? And she was like, we don't have any children. And that's the exact opposite. That's like, it's funny. It got her, it got her laugh, but the guy was like, wait, what? Like, it's like there. And so there's really interesting kind of tenets around why you commit to the people to help to make them amazing if you can. And then if you can't, then it's just, you don't join.
Well, I was laughing because as soon as you said Joan Rivers, I knew she was going to be the antithesis.
But she was a pretty funny woman. So
very, very, very funny. But she's not going to hand it off to somebody else. No. The interesting thing about that holding your beliefs lightly is that's basically the scientific attitude toward it too. And so part of our culture, human culture has not been that adamant about that kind of idea ever. But our scientific culture that keeps growing is because, if you don't hold your theories lightly, you don't learn when something new comes in. You can be too stuck to it. And it's the habit of everybody to be stuck to what they learned as a child, they learned here, or they learned in grad school as a scientist, and get their PhD in. And so it's a useful thing across the board in culture. You can't just give up whatever you think. But if you hold it lightly, then you're at least open to another possibility.
That's so interesting. It's like I think that the reference to scientific methodology really resonates. I do work with the Rockefeller Foundation, which has just been a delight to do during this, and have been doing some work on pandemics and pandemic preparation with their pandemicist John O. Quick, who wrote The End of Pandemics. And it's so interesting how like he's so good at this because he can commit, but also like not commit. Like it's like he can do the right kind of like, he's like, we don't know. Like it's like today we don't know, and so we have to just kind of continuously evolve our hypotheses, I think. So
yeah, it's you have so many good stories from different institutions that you've worked with in your book, but in the case of the Rockefeller Foundation too, it's just an aside, but John D. Rockefeller, I think Jr., the one who set up the fund, he was a very conservative man, and he wanted certain things done with his money, and he set it all up. And within 10 years, the board of directors, after he passed, all had different ideas, and everything got changed around. It's a good example of not holding so strongly to what you think, because if you set up any organization and expect it to keep going after your death the way you want it to, you're deluding yourself.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting because like one of the places that where I was a resident, I was fortunate to be a resident at the Rockefeller at Bellagio in Lake Como as I was writing the book, and it's an interesting thing. That's a great example where this place where it has a lot of convenings and gatherings of very important people who come together, and it really like it's a great example where every time like somebody new comes in, you reevaluate, well, does this matter? Like, should we even be doing this kind of gathering and convenings? And then they always come back to, yes, it does matter. Like we need to be having these conversations continuously. So yeah, I think you bring up a great point, George, which is like, it's like, always evaluate. Like, it's like, it does it still feel right? Oh, maybe it does, it's like, and I think that's something that we really need to get good at, is kind of like be kind of like pretty good about being like, this makes sense for us.
Well, you don't go into it directly, but I think one of the things you talk about in the COVID pandemic and the effect on everybody is in having conversations, is that we're doing this all by Zoom instead of in person. And Zoom is, and if you adapt to it, you can actually be very personal and be a good listener and do good conversations over Zoom. But the technology isn't as good as in person. And it never will be. Just like people who've always worried that live theater would disappear
Right.
because of movies. It's never going to, because there's a different thrill going on when there's individual minds right there doing the performance. So the same thing with conversations. But as you say, I mean, we can still do, if you follow the rules, if you pay attention to what you're talking about and that what you're aiming for, you still can achieve it even with technological interference in our daily lives in this way.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And also I will say, it's like one thing that just I will say about the book is that it's like, it actually, or about my theory around this is that it's like, technology doesn't necessarily degrade the conversation. It actually, it's just another form. And one of the things I talk about, there's like a short section that's about how to have conversations during a pandemic it's like at the very end during on Zoom. And I'm basically like, it's like, choose the medium for what you need to do, right? So like there are things where the right thing to do is just to get on the phone with somebody and just have a kind of conversation, like in a very kind of like whatever. Sometimes it's Zoom, sometimes it's like a Google Doc, what might be the right way. And then I live in a two rural context. I live in Maine and upstate New York. And so honestly, I got to see a friend of mine last night. We were outside counting the stars. It's like it was cold, but it was like, it was still, there was togetherness around it. And so I think if we get creative around what the medium is, we can actually still have these really important conversations that we need and get that sense of belonging and connection that we so need to continue.
Well, you focus on what the substance of conversation should be, what the goal is, and I think when you're forced into a new situation, new technology, it might force people to get out of the habits they were in and maybe be a little bit more attentive to what the substance is of what they were going for. So it might, even when people go back to the way things were, they might be much more attentive and appreciative of what we had. So let's hope it lasts.
I have a lot. Yeah, I know it doesn't seem like it's in vogue, but I have a lot of hope around this. And I'll tell you a funny story, George, about the book, which I don't think is in there. But the book I sold was about failing conversations. Like why have we lost the ability to have conversations? So sold that. Go meet with my publisher. My publisher, it's like like you go to a fancy Japanese restaurant, like you feel like you're a New York City like author, and it's this amazing thing. And she basically stopped and she's like, by the way, you can't use the word design in the title because it'd been called Designing Dialogue. And then she's like, and by the way, it has to be relentlessly optimistic. And I was like,
other than that, we love your idea.
Yeah, exactly. And I was like, okay, that's a different book. But honestly, that was amazing because what happened is it meant I really had to go out and journey to find the places in the world where people had amazing conversations and made them work, even under the most dire circumstances. And as I say at the end of the book, like it made me realize that at the end I was cured. So one of these a woman basically asked me like if I had been, how did it feel? Was I cured? And I was like, I hadn't realized I was sick, but I was. It turns out. And so if I seem a little like, starry-eyed, I'm just like, it's like we can get there. I promise. In fact, we are there. We are having hard conversations all the time as humanity. So, just
does anyone ever come up to you and say, or just have a conversation with you, and at the end say, "I almost never have conversations like that, but you must have them every day," and that they miss it,
It's Yeah, I mean, but the reality is that it's like people do have conversations. Yes, I mean, I get that a lot. I'm lucky. I get to be in a lot of conversations, and I get to sort of I meet a lot of people, which I know is sort of strange, and always has been. But yeah, but I also say that in my life, I've had magicians of conversation who I've been like, so there's my mother, my great grandmother, but there's also the former Prime Minister George Papandreou, who like is ancient Greek to his core, who taught me about symposia, and Dr. Vivek Murthy, the former Surgeon General, who taught me so much about pause and when to reflect. So I've been lucky in my life to be able to have like these remarkable people who've been kind of tutors to me, and help me kind of learn how to do this and help others do it. That's the thing I just want to kind of say. It's the point here is that it's like, the reason I called it making conversation is that it's like I really want to get away from the notion that it's like it's creative, or it's like anything you think you can't do, you can make a conversation. It's like if you can make your bed, you can make a conversation. And I feel like the key point here is that they're the most important things we have. They're the most important things we do. And if you're not thinking about how you're making them and making them work, then you're losing humanity's kind of like most fundamental tool. And that would be a real loss. I mean, you all are a great example of how enduring conversation is to kind of create change and make things happen.
You tell stories. You mentioned George Papandreou, the Greek, was he the prime minister?
Yeah.
Why don't you tell a couple of things of how he did it? It didn't sound like a usual European, or certainly not, Greek. I mean, you always get the idea of chaos in the Greek government, since World War II. So it was very interesting how he went about doing it. Tell a couple of stories, because people won't believe it.
And just to let you know, like George was interesting. He was raised in exile. His father had been exiled, so he was actually he I think he grew up in Berkeley and then went to school at Amherst. And then the moment he could go back to Greece, he went back to Greece, and he just did this like remarkable work. And I'm not going to even talk about when he was prime minister. I'm going to talk about what he did when he was Department of Education head, because it was really remarkable. So I'll tell you a story that George would tell you, which is that when he was that Department of Education head, they were, just as he got voted in, they were about to go on strike. And what he realized is, like, if he lost any time, a year of the children's lives were going to be lost. They would miss a year of school, right? So these are all things that feel somewhat familiar. And so usually if you became the Minister of Education, you wait for like the labor unions to come to you so you can say, like, we're going to discuss this. And George was about to do that, and then he paused and he said, no, forget it. I'm going to walk to them. So he walked to their office and he was like, let's talk about this. And then they sat down on the floor eating pizza and beer over 3 days, which is basically a symposium, by the way. And they worked through to a deal and stopped and stopped the strike from happening. So that's George. I mean, George is like this like masterful thinker. He was like, I don't want to lose a year of children's lives because I wait a day to do this. So he's very good at kind of knowing when to make what kinds of choice and when to balance.
Yeah, the thing that I want to move on to for going through your book a little bit more is the creative listening. We talked a little bit about your mother in it, but there were several other things that you brought up, and one of the things that you mentioned was maybe left over from your more failing conversations idea, which was about how television is disruptive and has been disruptive to conversation. So why don't we talk about that for a little while?
That's right. So it's interesting. Like Sherry Turkle, who I adore. When I remember meeting her in Aspen and having long conversations about technology and the problem it had. I actually believe that the root of our failing conversations was the moment we brought television to our dining room table. And so in the early 50s, it was like this kind of hallmark moment of kind of like really remarkable innovations in the television space. So the TV tray, I think, was invented in 1952. The clicker, or the whatever you call it, the
remote.
The remote was actually like in 1954, so people could skip commercials. The anchor man, who was Walter Cronkite, basically came in like around that same time. So and then we put politics and debate onto TV, right? So we developed pundits, Gore Vidal and I can't remember the other person, but the Plimpton and Vidal. But it's like that was where we started to erode dialogue in America. We gave our kitchen table, we gave our dining room table over to the television. The anchor person became our parent figure, and then as that kind of disseminated, we started to bring crisis and misery into places that it hadn't been before, like our bedrooms or our kitchens, and that's kind of where I think we sort of started to see the kind of the downfall of conversations in our lives. Does that make sense? I mean, I'm curious.
I have a slightly different take on it. I mean, I agree. It's one of the things that's interesting about the development of television is how it shifted based upon the demographics involved. When it gets started, it's only to 2 or 3 or 4% of the population, and clearly the richest part of the population adopted it first, on average, I would assume. And there's one example of that from the 90s. It was very late, but in Brazil, television was cheap enough for about half the population until the early 90s. And the television programs were already not, excellent. They were certainly not thought-provoking and so on and so forth. But suddenly it was cheap enough that everybody could have TV. So it went from 50% to 95% almost overnight, sometime in the early 90s. And the shows all went even a deeper dive in terms of the content quality. So I'm completely on that page from the quality point of view. But at the same time, especially in a crisis like this, how many people get their stories and hear the conversations? And so many people are alone, especially elderly people. And without that, I'll tell you one short story, a conversation that I had. I was at a mall in Madison, Wisconsin. I was looking to buy presents for a couple of girls. And there was a woman in a wheelchair, and she'd had diabetes, so she didn't have from her knee down on her legs, right? And she was mid-50s and clearly a rural Wisconsin woman. And she made Raggedy Ann and Raggedy Andy dolls, and they were, really well done. So I bought a couple for these girls, and then just to make conversation, I said to her, "So this is really great. It's a great hobby you have and everything. It must be so much nicer than watching the soap operas in the afternoon." And she paused for a second. And she says, "I love watching the soap operas in the afternoon." So I took my foot out of my mouth, and I said, "So that's very interesting. Why?" And she paused for a second. She said, "Because they take me places I've never been and show me people doing things I would never think of doing. So they expand my horizons." And I find that very important, at least for me. I was a young man at the time. Have always helped me understand another point of view on television, because it's all relative to what you know and what you understand and what your experiences are, as to whether it's expanding or contracting your mind.
So you just illustrated a bunch of things that I talk about perfectly. So and I'm gonna just say something. I just changed my mind. I got shivers. I got a little bit of I could feel the change happening. So I want to just sort of say one of the things I say that is really important in conversation is that when you feel a change, you mark a change in a conversation. So I'm just gonna say you changed me. So it's and I think you're right. It's I think about my mom and being she was in a home, for a long time, because she had to be in assisted living, and couldn't easily talk on the phone, was never able to manage an iPhone or an iPad, and really without the television, I think she would have been sort of left alone for so much time. And so although even at the very end, she had a way to kind of attract people. People would come by her room in their wheelchairs or whatever they were, so they could actually just spend time with her, even if she couldn't speak. She died last year, and it was a remarkable thing to see. But I do believe you. There is value for these things, and it's a great example of another medium, right? Another mechanism to have the conversations we need to have. So.
What's ironic is, as you say, most people are waiting to say what they want in the conversation. When you're watching TV, of course, you just have to keep waiting because. but there are people that don't wait. There are people who yell at their television and have a conversation with it. I mean, I'm not encouraging that, but
no, and there are families that are inspired by the television to have dialogue that they wouldn't have otherwise, right? So
Right.
it's like, so I think that we have to be really like it's like that's the point around this notion of kind of being endlessly optimistic is like when you just kind of like, so by the way, you did the perfect illumination, right? You told me like a 30-second story about somebody else that kind of both showed their values and showed me
I
something.
read your book.
Yeah, exactly. and you surprised me, and like, so it's like, see, and then through that you changed my mind and kind of expanded my thinking about that way I talk about this. So I will not be, I won't condemn it as much. That said, I will say one thing right now is I would be really wary around news hooks and kind of and balancing your life on the edge of a news hook, because I will say that and wherever like you take in your news, like I read my news and often listen to it on NPR, but it's like however you do it, you have to kind of you have to think pretty thoughtfully about kind of whether you give your life over to the news hook. So that's one thing I would be careful on.
Yeah, I think it's very clear, and there's an economic reason for it. The three networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS, they ruled the roost for such a long time, and then when cable came and took their income, they had to focus on something, and they focused on politics and sports. That's where all their money is, and so the longer and more time we spend on politics, the better their income is. It's really an unfortunate thing. It also, I think, is one of the reasons people talk about the blue state, red state split. But I think that 50-50 split is encouraged because it makes it a horse race always.
Yeah, I mean, the way I look at it is like that. So I was talking to my publisher in January, and I was like, we're gonna have a pandemic, and she was like, "You're crazy." And the only way I knew that is because I would skip the headlines,
right,
in something, and if you read down, you knew that something else was happening, right? And so it's like it's a fascinating thing to kind of like to think about, like how you train yourself and how you kind of take in the media and the news that you grapple with.
Yeah, and
go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say it's great that you read down in the material where there's a rational discussion about it. Other people go down and ask you what's going on, and everybody has their different sources, and it's I didn't mean by the story, especially on TV or the internet or anything, that this is all harmless fun or harmless conversation, because it's not.
I agree with that. I mean, I think we're coming from the same space. I think it's just that it's recognized. I mean, because it's like we don't actually watch television, but we do watch television shows. It's like it really matters to us that we can actually kind of that we can kind of do the escape that we need to be doing. So it's just
right.
like we do need the things. I wouldn't have made it through without Queen's Gambit, for instance.
Oh, you liked it too. I love that.
Yeah, and my husband now. Well, chess is too stressful, but we play dominoes. So
yeah. I want to say one thing about Queen's Gambit, as long as you brought it up. I love the ending of it, because I was in the Soviet Union in 1973, which was exactly when that was set, and they got it right, both the depression but also the generosity of the people. And I loved the ending that she skipped the president, went out and played chess with the people on the street. That was very well written, whoever did that.
Wasn't that an amazing moment? I'm trying to perfect my like look down and then look up look that she does so well in the Queen's Gambit.
Well, then we have a conversation about the Queen's Gambit, but maybe another time.
Yeah, definitely. Let's come back to that. It's important.
Early days of television. One last thing, you told about the toddler's truce in England. I don't think people know about this. That was a great little piece of information. Tell people about that.
Isn't that bizarre? So it's
bizarre.
So television in the UK for a while had this thing that was like an hour, and I think it was between 6 and 7, called Toddler's Truce, where parents could put their children to sleep without missing a program. So basically, all the programming would stop, so they wouldn't have to miss anything, and then they could actually put their children to bed. Which it's one of those things where it's like, this. It's like where the fact that like reality is stranger than fiction. You're like I came across that. There's another story in there about Abraham Lincoln, where I remember like I was talking to my editor, and she was like, "Yeah, this didn't happen. Somebody made this story up about duels," and I'm like, it's a real thing. It happened. And so it's like, I was like so happy to prove that, yes, that Abraham Lincoln and duels did in fact happen.
I can back you up. We just did a book on Abe, and it was in there too.
Oh, was it?
That
Oh,
was
good
just
to know.
written. Yeah. So that was good. Yeah, you described it very well. Why don't you tell that? Because I like that. That was setting the rules. We're not to that yet, but let's tell that one right now, because that was a great way that he got out of the duel.
I think it's so fascinating, and it's like so I really love that story as well. So it's and it was like one of these things where you find it and you're like, this is a gift. And by the way, I talked to like news outlets and they're like, this is so futuristic, and I was like, no. This is so ancient. Like, this is all history. Like, it's like, go back and read the history books and you're going to find this. And so, there's this thing that governed duels called the Code Duello. And most often we think about it in the Hamilton way, which is like the 10, it's like the countdown, and there's like very strict rules. By around the 1840s, around the world, people were like, yeah, I kind of don't want to die. It's like, I really don't want to be insulted, but I'm not sure I want to die over this. And so around that time, they shifted the language of the Code Duello. So, I mean, Hamilton, ironically, was a bit of an anomaly at the time, because the rules became then that if I challenged you to a duel, George, which I won't, but if I did, then my role was to give you the rules. So you got to design the rules so that you would actually, like, most likely we would both survive, typically. And so the most famous duel that was never fought, at least the one that I can think of, is Abraham Lincoln was challenged to a duel by a friend of his on something that they disagreed on, but then they gave the rules over to Abraham Lincoln. So basically, he was the one who had the rules, and Abraham Lincoln was like, "Well, what am I going to do?" And then he basically developed the rules. And so when they got to the dueling field, he had decided that they would fight with Revolutionary War broadswords. They would have to stay 12 feet apart, so it's COVID safe duel, and they would fight in, like, I think they were in regalia, and basically, the guy who challenged him was like, this is so ridiculous, and they all started laughing, and they just went off and had a drink. And so it's a great example. I mean, so I use that in the book to talk about the idea of critique, which is one of the things that I have to do most often in my work, is kind of give critique of their work. And it's one of the things I've learned from that, or I actually was doing before, but now I'm like, I've got pretty good backing, is I would always say, okay, I have the power. I'm going to give the power to you, the team that I'm going to be working with. You tell me what not to touch, and I won't touch it. You tell me where you need the most help, and then you hand the power back to me. And so we'll just work together on the things that you need to do. And that simple shifting of, like, the power for a moment really radically shifts the way that dialogue kind of plays out and the way critique feels because of that. So that's how I got to. It wasn't because of Abraham Lincoln. I learned that afterwards. But
yeah, it's a great story, and 12 feet away with broadswords, not anybody's even gonna get scratched, right? So
yeah, no, we're fine.
You'd lose your honor by looking ridiculous even more so.
Exactly. Totally.
Another story that you told that I really liked was about the girl who said she didn't read. And a lot of students say that they don't read. And then you went into her bedroom. So why don't you tell the story? I thought that was great.
This is one of my favorite stories. And this was done for a major online university. And basically the university had done their research, and they basically were like, no, our students aren't readers. We know that. Definitely, we know that nobody reads, and we would be going out doing these ethnographic work, like going out into sitting in people's living rooms and talking about how they learn and what they do, and kind of go through their online courses with them. And this woman was like, who we were with, was basically like, oh, just so you know, like, or we were like, so do you read? And she's like, no, I never read. I was not born a reader. That's just not the way I consume information. Like, it's all through video content or whatever. And so we're like, okay. And so at IDEO, well, we would always end by kind of walking through somebody's house. Be like, give us a little tour around. We'd like to get a sense of who you are as a person. And so we're walking through her house, and we get into her bedroom. And in the bedroom, there's pretty much every single book where a vampire is having sex with a werewolf, like that you can possibly imagine, because you knew we were going to get back to sex. That's just the way it was going to go. So, but we were like, okay, wait, you totally read. Like, there's thousands of books here, because there's a lot of books written about vampires having sex with werewolves and so on. And she's like, oh, well, that's not reading. That's like trash. And we're like, no, that's reading. And by the way, that's that's a huge kind of tell on what kind of material helps her kind of advance, and it gives us a really remarkable thing to do. So it's why one of the things that's really interesting, and I can't remember the name of the site, Wattpad I think is what it's called. It is a fan fiction site. And the idea that you can use that fan fiction site as a way to kind of get kids to write and read is a really interesting kind of way in, I think, actually.
Is that one of the ideas you had? I mean, you mentioned that you used that to find something that was addicting.
That's right. Yeah. So it's like if you could wrap things up into things that felt more like they were like little like cliffhangers, like little good stories, right? That like that leave you hanging in a way, and then they kept you coming back, kind of like the way my grandmother used to do. Then like you were gonna kind of you couldn't help it. You become addicted to the conversation, and you had to be there. So yeah, that's one of the ways we did it. It wasn't necessarily we put vampires and werewolves in it, but it was just like we really thought through the way the content was actually kind of like poised, set up, and kind of and how short it could be. I mean, one of the things I'm doing right now is we're building out a WhatsApp 30-second curriculum that allows you to kind of begin to practice these things in really simple, short ways. And we're kind of applying the same principles there as we go. So
you might have a little trouble selling that to Yale, though. Did you hear me? Yeah. I said you might have a little trouble selling that to Yale University.
Yeah, Yale's not the intended audience.
I know. All right. So that's creative listening. The next section is clarity. And you almost sounded like a lawyer there, define the terms first. You know? But why don't you say a little bit about that idea?
Yeah, I have a friend who's clarity. Yeah, I have a friend who's a lawyer who's like, if we followed this, we would have no business. Like, I have a lot of friends who are lawyers. So yeah, the premise here actually, and this quite real, like this came out of architecture, is that as I was like learning architecture, I realized that there were words that you learn that actually hide meaning, not clarified meanings. So a classic example, and by the way, there's a big backlash right now in architecture. Architects are changing their language, and that's a really good thing. Is like, so you would say intervention, and what you really meant was a window or a bench or a bookshelf or something else. But as a client, there's no way to know what an intervention is. There's no kind of clarity in that thing. And so one of the things when I went to IDEO, I really wanted to do is basically be like, hey, like we're going to talk normal. Like we're going to kind of get rid of all the jargon and everything in there. And I will say the embarrassing part of that chapter, which was originally called Talk Normal, but of course had to become a C, is that in the opening paragraph, I don't know if you noticed this, there's a word that I put in there, which is obfuscates. Like make sure that it, and I was like, we could have caught that. Like I was like, I can't believe I'm using obfuscates. But really quickly on the history of that, like I think that one of the things that really kind of was inspirational for me was when we were doing work in a hospital, basically kind of focused on like the emergency room, realizing that about half the people in the room knew what the word triage was. And triage is a really important word to know if you're coming into the emergency room. And triage, as you might know, comes from the ancient, or it comes from the idea of kind of separating the wheat from chaff. And then it was used during World War I in the trenches as a way to figure out who's going to be able to be saved and who wasn't. But if you're in an emergency room, what you really need is someone to just say like, go here, this is important place, here, arrow, not triage. So the work we did with the healthcare professionals was like, listen, use specialized language when you're talking to each other. So don't, when you're in a surgery, say, give me the shiny knife thing that I'm going to use to whatever, just you say scalpel, like whatever that is. Right. But when you're talking to a patient, really try to talk as normal as possible. Yeah,
it was a very good example of, because every group of professionals ends up with their own kind of language that they learned, and they all learn the same things in school, and it becomes obscure and obfuscates what they're talking about to other people, right?
That's totally right. And so it's like I feel like it's like, and again, it's not to say that like we need you to be pros. Like it's like that's like we need healthcare professionals to be like really good, but it's like, but with us, just make sure to try to talk as normal as possible.
Well, you picked 7 C's, all of which are normal. So let's go to the fourth one. Yeah, third one. Fourth one, context. Context. When I read your chapter, I thought this is sort of like feng shui for conversations. It's locations.
Oh my God, that's the best compliment I've ever gotten. I'm not sure you meant as a compliment, but I love that. That is like genius. Thank you.
So the idea
I mean,
for context, for conversation. I mean, you talk about how important the location is and everything like that, but maybe give a couple of your examples so that people understand why the context is sometimes important in a conversation.
Yeah, and it's interesting, like as you know, in the book, there's these things called these conversation breaks, which are these little kind of things. I was just with my team the other day, and they're like, I never really understood this one conversation break called script setting or script spotting, which is the conversation break just beforehand. And I was like, that's about recognizing that there's scripts in every conversation, and you have to be able to spot them as they go forward. But one of the things that really like solidly holds our sets the kind of tone of a conversation is the spaces that we have our conversations in. Even now. Like, I know it might seem strange, but it's like, but you and I spent some time thinking about the spaces we were in beforehand and how we did it. And it's because it matters. It matters to the way the conversation is understood and kind of, and is taken. And so it's why, for instance, when I did the PBS NewsHour thing, I did it from my kitchen table because I knew I wanted to talk about the kitchen table and what happens when we lost the kitchen table conversations. So space really matters. And I'm just going to ask you, George, like if I asked you to describe a board meeting, what would you say to me?
Exactly what you said in the book, a big long table with in fact, I worked at a law firm where they created a whole series of those things, every one of them to look exactly like a movie set for conversations at board meetings. And then it was used in the movie Michael Clayton years later. So they hit it. That's right. They hit it right.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And so it's like, so, and then if I were to say AA meeting, you would say probably church basement, folding chairs, whatever. And the reality is that's a great example where it's like most people, when you say board meeting, which I didn't say board room, I said board meeting, will describe the room. Right. Which is that's because we are like supremely good visual thinkers. Like we're really good at kind of like our memories are built based on the mnemonics, like mnemonic devices, and those are often quite strongly visual. And so it's why if I ask you where you were when 9/11 happened, you'll know. It's like, or where like ask you where you were when last Wednesday happened, you'll know. Like it's like most likely. I mean, it depends if whether you were tuned in or not. But 9/11 probably more so, it's like, and so one of the things that I actually talk about in the book, and there's positive haunting and negative haunting. So sitting at my grandmother's like swing, I get haunted by my grandmother in a good way. I get haunted by the really good conversations that she and I used to have. But if you go, for instance, into the room where everybody always gets fired, which, there's always like that one space where somebody's always like getting like, it's like whatever, then you're going to be haunted by those conversations that are there. And so what I really talk about a lot is that really be careful. I mean, example, it's like if you were in bed watching the news when 9/11 happened, maybe consider getting rid of that bed, or maybe consider like, changing where your bed, where your sleep is. If you're just so you the conversations you have there actually feel like the right thing. So.
Yeah, it's true for a lot of people. If someone dies in your house, you often get rid of the bed too. Same basic idea. In this case, it was just coming into our house from the outside.
That's right. And I will say what's interesting about that is that I thought this was going to be useless. Like as I was having to like edit the book during the pandemic, I was like, this doesn't matter at all. And I was like, oh wait, this totally matters. It's actually almost more useful than you would imagine. So.
Well, you talk about sacred spaces and all kinds of things like that in your book too, as asides. But at the same time, that's been very carefully designed for Millennium also to carry on those conversations. And as you say, the kitchen is designed that way. And I just one shout out to Alex Hernandez, who designed the Commonwealth Club space a little bit when we moved into a new building, designed for really good for conversations and it really for big lectures and medium-sized lectures and small spaces. It's got just the right mix of things. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to use it for almost a year, but it's a great space for conversations.
It really is.
Very cleverly done.
Yeah, and one thing I'll just sort of say, and I mean, obviously, like I was originally an architect by training, but I'm don't lose faith in the power of a building. Like we need buildings now. Like we're going to need homes to go. We're going to need places to have these conversations. Like when this is over. So it's like that building may feel like it's a remnant, but it's not. It's really you will need to go home at some point.
it's a fascinating part of our current culture that we don't build really, I mean, we build some really cool buildings, but we don't build the kind of permanent structures that have been built for thousands of years before as a space, when we have much more money to build those kinds of things. The amount of the income of a village that went into their church was a tremendous amount and they spent 100 years on it. I always think of talking about conversations and board meetings. I always think about the Parthenon in Rome. And the Parthenon in Rome has been there for 2,000 years. And people say it's a miracle it's still here. I said, no, the real miracle is that at least 15 times the board of directors of the Parthenon over the last 2,000 years has had to have a meeting and decide it's more expensive to repair this and keep it than it is to tear it down and sell off the pieces. But we have to do it anyway. 15 times in a row that decision was made. That's the miracle. Not that it's still standing. That's the way I look at it.
It's so interesting. I got to spend time with some people in Athens, where one of the things that they have started to do, I don't know if you know this, is with construction, when they find a new ruin, they're just like, yeah, let's just cover that up for the next generation because we don't need any more ruins. So which I don't know if that's, I mean, that was I think at the museum at the Parthenon. So I have to believe that that's a true story. But it's kind of a remarkable thing. I think that which I kind of believe. Let the next generation discover something. That's something that's a gift.
Yeah. The Egyptians feel the same way. They have so much under the sand,
But they still keep finding stuff. It seems.
Oh yeah. And they're always hoping it'll be gold.
Yeah, exactly.
So I've been looking down because a lot of questions are coming in, and let's ask a couple before we get to the next two from our listeners. So Diane asked, there are so many parallels between communication theory and mindfulness meditation, keeping space and equanimity and keep beginning again. And we haven't gotten to that yet, but you do mention that in your book. So you want to talk about it a little bit?
I do. And Diane, clever, and I don't know which Diane it is, but hi, Diane. I will say that the reason I ended up going with my publisher is that because you go around, you get these little pitches, and they're like, here's what we can do for you. Here's what this is my publisher at HarperCollins, who I just love. Came in, she was like, I love this book. She's like, I'm a deep meditator, and it really reminds me of mindfulness for conversation. That was her pitch back to me. Mm-hmm. And I was like, you totally get it. And that's it. And we had a deal basically within 24 hours because I just felt like she had so much respect for what the content was and really did understand it. And she had also gone through a really interesting period of mourning. And so she had a lot of thinking around kind of how this plays. So she had a very sophisticated take on why this might matter. So.
All right, and here's a question from Linda Lenoir. Mr. Dust, can you talk more about your experience at IDEO? It has such a diverse group of people working there. How did you help to make conversing easier for the staff?
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting thing. I mean, it's like my team now, which is not at IDEO, but is on my own. It's like they're very mutt-like in the sense that they're kind of they're mixed breeds. Like I have a mixed breed dog, and we get along really, really well. And so honestly, one of the things that you start to do is you establish a set of rules for the way conversations will happen, right? So just like I talked about the rules for critique, you actually think about different kinds of constraints so that you can actually have people have the dialogue they want to have. And so I really think that's one of the ways that we get to do it. I mean, just to be honest, I was on the phone with the CEO of IDEO, Sandy Spiker, last night, and I basically was like, let's set the rules for this conversation, because it's like what we're going to talk about here is super sensitive, and I wanted to make sure that she felt good and I felt good, and so we sort of set the rules and we abided by them, and it allowed us to get to a very rich, deep spot without actually having to without damaging anyone. And so I think one of the premises that I have is that there are always rules in a conversation. So get good at spotting them. And if they're not working, consider setting or resetting the rules. And George, if you can't change the rules and you're in a conversation that makes you unsafe, it's okay for you not to step into that conversation. If people can't make the conversation feel good to you, then it's one less meeting in your life. It's one less conversation. Don't do it until it feels safe.
Yeah. Yeah, we sort of have learned as children, at least some of us have learned as children, that one has to fix every situation and work with whatever one has to deal with and everything like that. And that that may work in a more homogenous culture, and the broader the culture gets, the more that's not such good advice, you know.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting because it's like there in the book, I think I talk about it, or I don't know, maybe it's in something else, the responsive classroom, which is where basically teachers work with students to actually set the rules for to get to the goals for their year. And the rules for that are like, they have to be completely positive. They have to be like, so instead of saying, don't run with the scissors or a hatchet or whatever, it's like stay safe, you know, is the thing. Or my favorite rule of all kind, joy, or be joyful, which I just think is like amazing. So yeah.
Some teachers need to learn that first.
Well, kindergartners are pretty good at it on their own, so it's good. So.
Yeah, at least the first graders are.
That's true. That's true.
So this is a comment from Teresa Marlene. I'm quarantined alone, so the TV is my saving grace now. So she's backing up the earlier conversation we had.
Teresa, like, more power, and I'm really glad George changed my mind. So thank you.
And the next question, Shelley Duncan asks or comments. My dad's dad would say we were given 2 ears and 1 mouth, emphasizing how important listening in conversation always is.
That is so great. And honestly, one thing I just love about that is like, like that little, like, I think it's a homily, but it's like that little simple phrase are like those things are like so easily memorable. And and also whenever you invoke something that like you got taught from your family, it's like you're bringing them back to life, right? I don't know if he's alive or whatever, but it's like bringing them into the conversation. And so that's a gift in so many ways. So I really appreciate that. I love those kinds of sayings. I did, just so you know, George, I did a whole thing in Texas where I just tried to decipher Texanisms. And then they try to decipher my Texan, my versions of like sayings, and like we got about half of it right. It's like it was really fun.
Well, it's true with Europeans too. They have lots of different sayings that are almost incomprehensible if you don't know them until you can match them up with a similar one. I mean, Americans have so many of them that come from the Wild West, and people don't even realize. You know, it's like it's left over. That's totally
right. Well, and it's funny because it's like I lived in France for part of my high school years, and the sayings there, like if you could get a saying down, people thought you were fluent in French. So if you could say like on the tip of my tongue, then people were like, oh my God, you're a fluent speaker. I'm like, nope, I just know that. It's like.
All right, so here's a good another follow-up from Teresa Marlene. With everything being virtual now, I'm very concerned we are losing our personal touch. So we were discussing that earlier. And I personally think that personal touch comes from your personality. And I think everybody's going to be very eager to, even those that were getting bored with it or tired of it, are not going to be so tired of it. I think it'll be a very good renaissance for personal touch right after this is over. I don't know. What do you think, Fred?
I think that's really true. I think that there's a lot of people who are sort of saying we're gonna sort of see like a renaissance that will emerge out of this, because people are gonna be so like anxious to kind of go into this, and so obviously I believe that's true, but I do appreciate the notion of the personal touch, because I don't know if I wrote about it, but one of the things I wanted to talk about is the idea of owning your voice, you know, which is like there's like only one voice that I have, and it's like I can't change it for you, you know. It's like so I show up the way I show up, and that's the same thing. It's like it's what you're talking about, I think, is your personal touch, and you can really only be you very well, and that's a really remarkable thing.
Well, you mentioned the showing up. That's one of the comments, but you didn't say owning your voice, as I remember in the book. However, that's a really interesting point, because a lot of people, at least our age, go to high school reunions and stuff like that. And a lot of times you cannot recognize the face of the person or anything, but you can recognize their voice.
Right.
You know, the voice is the thing that's about the hardest thing to fake. I mean, we have some artists that are very good at imitating other people and their voices and so on and so forth, but that's very hard to do. Mostly people with their own voice is very distinctive, every single person.
You know, it's so funny because I'll tell you a little story. So I had a young woman designer who worked with me for years. She actually went on to kind of be the co-founder of ID.org and now runs this amazing institution. And she had a very high little voice, the kind of voice that people will say, oh, those are the kinds of voices that CEOs can't hear. And so for years and years and years, she was like, please give me voice training. And I was like, I really didn't want to do it. And I was just like, and she was like, please, please, please. And so I finally got her voice training. And I found her outside of IDEO one afternoon smoking cigarettes. And I was like, what are you doing? And she was like, this is what my voice coach told me not to do. It's the only thing that's going to deepen my voice. Yeah. And I was like, we're firing that voice coach. And we're going to do the work to make sure that every time you say something smart, we're going to say, thank you, Patrice, for saying that. Oh, I said her name, but she'd be okay with it. It's like we just got to see her, but we would say thank you. And like my favorite moment in all time was actually being in a meeting with a bunch of Texan men, and she was saying something really genius. And the main guy who ran this kind of consortium in Texas was like, everybody shut up and listen to Little Squeak or something like that. Like everybody just stopped and turned and listened to Patrice. And that was remarkable. It was like, little bit. I think he called her a little bit.
That's remarkable in Texas. So a very unusual CEO.
Well, she's a very unusual
problem.
leader. Yeah. But I think it's like that's the point. Is like just like stick with your voice. Like it's like it needs you. You need it. It's a smart way to go forward.
Well, I'll tell you how somebody turned around a conversation in my work. I went with a Texan, since you brought up a Texan. Went with a Texan client who worked for an oil company down to Bolivia, and to do a deal where we're going to do a water power plant on a river that used to run for the tin mines. And the tin mines have been owned by one family for 350 years. And that family, we were negotiating with a joint venture. Well, that family, the guy in charge of that family, the patriarch of the family, had been the Secretary of State for Bolivia and all kinds of things. But he was 5'5" or 5'4", and not his voice, but his height. Right. And the Texan was 6'4", and he did the Lyndon Johnson thing. When he wanted to do something, he leaned over the other person, and tried to intimidate him down. And he did that at about 9 a.m. one time in the negotiations. And I could tell he was the Texan was my client. The guy on the other side was the Bolivian. I could tell he couldn't stand it. And I was trying to figure out, how am I going to solve this problem? Well, he solved it for me, the Bolivian. At about 11 o'clock, he suddenly said, that's enough for today. He said, I think what we need is, this is your break idea, right? I think what we need is to take a break and let's all come over to my house for dinner tonight. So everybody come to my house for dinner. So we're here in La Paz, Bolivia. It's at 13,000 feet. We go to his house. It's his family house that's been there for 350 years.
Oh my God.
The Texan comes in, he sees original Spanish art from 300 years ago on the walls, silver everywhere. They were brought into a space. This really is all your stuff. It's brought into a big room with a long, thin table to seat about 20 people. But the table only took up about 10% of the room. It was just a huge, big, wide open room with art all over it. And so we were all sitting there, and he put the Texan at one end of the table and himself at the other end of the table. And we chatted about a bunch of nonsense for a while, just chit chat. And then the host, the Bolivian, said, "Is everyone ready to eat?" "Yes, everyone's ready." And he just went like that. 8 doors opened up on both sides. These servants came out, put everything down, disappeared through the doors again, came, and it was an orchestrated thing. My client never leaned over him again.
I love that. And I'm curious for Teresa, like, you just took us someplace, George. That was amazing. Like, it's like you just like, it's like you basically did a little like Queen's Gambit in like whatever that was, like in 45 seconds. It was really well done. Thank you. I loved it.
All right, so it's getting near the end, but let's see. Cheryl Gale says, "It's extremely difficult for me to remain calm and centered when I hear the word 'like.' Repeatedly, any suggestions on how to talk to a person in a way that is not offensive?" All right, since I'm in California, no, go ahead, Fred.
Well, I mean, honestly, I say, like, I have to be honest quite a lot. I also say awesome, but to be honest, the other thing is, I'll go to Maine, for instance, and everybody says correct. And I'm just like, so you'll be like, "Oh, like, I think I had too much to drink." And they're like, "Correct." It's like, and you're like, wait, how does that happen? So there are these little things that do that. And one of the things I've been talking about a lot recently, it's not in the book, is to recognize the things that are triggering to you. And one of the things, so like, it's something that basically kind of makes you feel like, "Oh, I'm going to react to that," like whether it's in positive or negative or whatever. And when you feel like that's happening, maybe take a pause, take a breath, and then just before you actually respond. And I think often that very short breath will allow you to kind of make sure that you're not triggered. And let me give you one example, which is in the book, which is the hardest conversation I ever had was with my New York neighbor the day I moved in. So I basically was like, she came pounding the door. I was alone in the house. Like we had just moved in. Like there was like, it was just like stuff all over. I was going to cry. I was like, why did I move to New York? And she's just like, you broke all the building's rules and you used the elevator that I wasn't supposed to use. And she's just like screaming at me. And I was like, there's no way I'm going to be just like this kind of like, let this New York woman just kind of take me down because I'm Californian. And I paused, took a breath. I was about to jump down her throat. And then I was like, is this really the way you want our conversation to start? And she stopped and she was like, no, it's not. And then that's it. We were friends for like the next 3 years that we lived in that building. So just reflect on it, like that, like the things that trigger and whether or not that's like really the way you want to kind of go into a conversation.
You should tell that story to the state departments all around the world, because really, it's the way a lot of conversations start. And we do so many things in politics that could be fixed with a little bit of understanding. But again, that's a different topic.
Well, just so you know, that will happen. So
yeah, exactly. But I wanted to have you tell that one story, which I just love, about the mayor of Bogota, how he solved the jaywalking problem. And may I say before he finishes with this, that there's lots of other good stories in the book too. We can't tell them all, but this one I want everyone to hear because it's just great.
Well, you know what? The problem. In a traditional lecture, this is the story I would always end on because I think it's just such a great story. So it's a good choice. So one of my heroes I've never met, Antonius Marcus, who was the mayor of Bogota at the time. One of the things they were really dealing with, and you still do, is the idea that like people are not very good at paying attention to stoplights and in Bogota, and they're not very good at paying attention to crosswalks. And so what would happen is if you were jaywalking and a car was like speeding through, like the traffic fatality deaths, like the pedestrians was really high when he inherited it. And they thought of all these different things that they would do that they could figure out. They're like, we're going to do really heavy fines, but he's like, nobody's going to ever pay the fines and all these kinds of things. And finally, he was like, I know what everybody hates more than anything, which is like losing their pride, like not like being humiliated in public. And so that's like a deep Colombian thing. And so and it's by the way, that's just a deep thing everywhere. And so one of the things he did is he trained the police officers to be mimes. He trained them, he actually in some cases he replaced them with mimes. And what he found is just being kind of followed by a mime, which nobody wants, is enough to basically like stop the conversation from happening, like to stop the infraction. And I think by the end of his tenure, traffic fatalities had dropped by about half. And so one of the reasons why I always end with that is that it's a great example where it's like sometimes you can't know, right? Like it's like sometimes you can't know the answer, and so sometimes just consider whether you're going to be brave enough to put that action into the world. And sometimes that's the right thing to do. And even a conversation can be even just a small act of bravery, tiny, not like flying across like the Atlantic, but just like very small, and learn to practice like an everyday kind of bravery, little small thing.
You used a couple other examples like that when you say it really works. And unfortunately, it's based on shame, and shaming culture, of course, is something that we're getting more of. I even wonder sometimes whether we haven't got a cultural exchange going on with China right now, where they're borrowing capitalism and we're borrowing their shame culture.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. But I will say that one of the things that is interesting about that is that it's still it's shaming, and yet mimes can be really funny, And so it's like it can actually, a good mime can actually allow you to kind of like play off of it. Going back to that Second City analogy, it's like where it's like it's really like they can both protect you and support you. It's like in this really interesting way. So.
Well, that's why I like the story, because I don't think we're going to get away. I mean, the Puritans were into shame culture, all kinds of, we can never get away from shame culture, but I think we at least should try to make it lighthearted, and then it will work, and it's not so damning.
Yeah, I think you're entirely right. But that's by the way, the reason why court jesters' lives were often quite short. So just be careful.
That joke have you told for me lately, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you very, very much, Fred. So ends another event at the Commonwealth Club in its 118th year of enlightened discussion. Looking forward to your next book, Fred.
Thanks
you so much for joining us.
It was a delight. Thank you so much, George.